Maggie Martin, who will be doing parts of our presentation throughout the meeting today. And here in the room with me, we also have Tom Bushatsky, ADWR Director. We have Carol Ward, the Deputy Assistant Director for Planning and Permitting at ADWR, and Clint Chandler, the Deputy Director. So thank you to all of them for being here today. I know I've mentioned before that these meetings and the preparation for the 5th management plans is very much a team effort, so I really appreciate all of their support today. If we could go to the agenda slide, please. So we do have a lot to cover today. I will run through just quickly a timeline of our plans for the 5th management plans, both completing the discussions that we're having in this group and working toward the drafting and adoption of those 5th management plans. We'll also be discussing in some detail today the proposals for non-golf turf facilities, so HOAs, parks, those types of things, and discussing the proposed conservation program for golf courses, for golf purposes. We also, as a part of that discussion, will be going into some details on proposals for the effluent incentive and allotment additions. So certainly have a full agenda today, and we're looking forward to continuing to work through all of this with you all. If we could go to the next slide, please. Next slide. Great, thank you. So in our previous meetings, we have gone through a lot of background. If you have not attended our previous meetings, I would really encourage you to go to our 5MP concepts page that you can find on ADWR's website. We have summaries of each of the concepts that we've discussed and some details regarding previous meetings that we've had. So we have detailed the 4MP conservation programs in previous meetings and also discussed what our goals are for the 5th management plans. We have, in previous meetings, laid out kind of tentative proposals for the calculation methods for allotments for turf facilities, both those non-golf and golf facilities. And in today's meeting, we'll be going into a little bit more detail on those proposals, updating those proposals in response to some of the feedback that we've gotten so far. Moving forward, obviously, we are working on a timeline. I'll talk a little bit more about the timeline in a couple minutes here, but we will need to be working toward finalizing these conservation programs so that we at ADWR can write up the draft language for those 5th management plans. Again, I will talk about this a little bit later, but the kind of phase 2 for this group will be to review and discuss some of that draft regulatory language. Next slide, please. One more. Great. So you all have seen this timeline slide previously. We've been using this for some time now in these meetings. Our original intent with the 5th Management Plans Work Group was to complete many of these stakeholder discussions by the end of 2020. We did not quite reach that goal, but we do want to continue these discussions that we are having to ensure that we're taking the time to fully flesh out those discussions and move forward with the proposals that we've been working on for those plans. We do still intend to take the bulk of this year of 2021 to draft the 5th management plans. We've already begun our initial stages of that process. I'll talk more about that in a minute here, but the important point here is that we will be sequencing that process in a way that allows for some of these discussions in these meetings to continue, these discussions with stakeholders in the regulated community to continue in these meetings, in these subgroup meetings over the next several months. This timeline of drafting these plans next year allows those plans to be adopted in 2022 in that promulgation section at the bottom. Allows those plans to be adopted over the course of 2022 2022, which means that those conservation plans would become effective on January 1st, 2025. Next slide, please. While we are working to provide sufficient space and time for these discussions, we are also on a very tight timeline here. And we need to make sure that we're moving forward with these conversations efficiently. You can see on this slide a potential timeline for the additional items that we'll need to discuss and how we might sequence having those discussions. Obviously, today we're talking through both golf and non-golf conservation programs. Depending on the type of feedback we get on those, we may need to have additional discussions regarding those conservation programs. So we have a tentative April date for a next turf meeting to follow up on any other items that need to be further discussed for this. And then in addition to that, as we draft the regulatory language for those fifth management plans for these programs that we've been developing together, we would bring that draft language back to this group for additional discussion and review. So the point there is that we want to make sure that we're having multiple points for feedback. The kind of ending of this first phase of the work group does not mean we're done taking feedback, but just that we're moving into a second phase of feedback on that more specific regulatory language. Next slide, please. The reason that we need to move ahead so quickly is that we are on an aggressive timeline, as I mentioned. And we want to make the point that we no longer have multiple AMA offices, and we will be drafting all 5 fifth management plans simultaneously. This process, we recognize, is a little bit different than the drafting for previous plans. As with previous plans, the structure of the programs will largely match across the AMAs, but there will be some time for AMA customization in cooperation with stakeholders in these groups, in cooperation with the GUACs, to consider any tweaks that may need to be made to those individual conservation programs for specific AMAs. And as I mentioned earlier, these subgroups will reconvene as we have that draft regulatory language prepared to review and discuss and provide further feedback on that regulatory language. So with that, I will go ahead and pause for questions at this time. We'd be glad to take any questions or comments that people may have on that timeline. Yeah, so we'll pause now. McKenna, if you could click and start that timer, please.
I'm not seeing any questions or comments in the chat box.
Great, thank you, Maggie. Then we will go ahead and move on to the next portion on our agenda. The next piece that we're going to be talking about today, if we could go to the next slide, please, is going to be the proposed program updates for those 2 subsectors here that I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. We do always want to reiterate in these meetings kind of our guiding principle for the development of these plans. We have a lot of goals for the development of these conservation programs, but ultimately this is kind of our mandatory checkbox. So the one item that we have to get to is that we are designing these programs to achieve reductions in withdrawals of groundwater. So with that reminder, I will go ahead and hand things off to Maggie, and she will talk through some of the conservation program details for non-golf turf facilities. Maggie?
Yes, thank you, Natalie. My name is Maggie Martin. I'm a management plan specialist, and today I'll be discussing our proposed program updates for non-golf facilities. You can switch to the next slide, McKenna. Thank you. I'm going to briefly review the current non-golf turf conservation program, and then I'll also provide an overview of our updated program proposal. Next slide, please. The current conservation program for non-golf facilities includes a maximum annual water allotment, and this is for facilities that are over 10 acres of water-intensive landscaped area. It limits new facilities to less than 90 acres, and there are some additional exemptions for cemeteries. The program also includes allotment additions, adjustments for effluent and flex accounts, and these additional components also relate to golf courses, which we'll be discussing in further detail later on in the presentation. So for now, we'll just focus on the allotment calculations. In the current conservation program, the maximum water allotment is calculated using 3 application rates that range slightly depending on which AMA you're in. One of the categories is turfed acres, and that is at a rate of 4.45 to 4.9 acre feet per acre. One is for low water use landscaped areas, and that's at a rate of 1.5. And there is also a rate for total water surface area, and that ranges from 5.5 to 6.2 acre feet per acre. These application rates are then multiplied by the number of acres in a given facility and then summed together to create an allotment for the facility. Next slide, please. So in our previous meeting, we presented a potential idea that we called use-dependent application rates. This idea would have updated the way that the maximum annual allotment is calculated for non-golf turf facilities. The calculation method was centered around the idea that different types of turf have different application rates. We proposed an idea that included athletic and ornamental turf types. So athletic would have included sports fields and would have had a higher application rate, whereas ornamental might have included landscaping at commercial sites or common areas and HOAs and would have had a lower application rate. We received some feedback on this potential idea that suggested that this method would have presented issues and complexities that didn't previously exist, and also that this idea would have been administratively difficult on facilities. So we hear you, and we took these concerns into consideration and are choosing to move away from this use-dependent application rate method. Next slide, please. So our new proposed program update essentially looks like the original conservation program with a couple of changes to better incorporate scientific data. The turf application rates are derived from assuming 50% athletic turf and 50% ornamental turf. So they are averages of the athletic turf application rate and the ornamental turf application rates, which values are based on an analysis conducted by the town of Gilbert. Similar to the forest management plans, there would also be an application rate for low water use and water surface area. The water surface area application rate would remain the same as in the forest management plan for the respective AMAs, and the low water use application rate would be updated. in updating the golf application rates, we had a presentation and recommendation from Dr. Paul Brown in the University of Arizona. We would update this application rate to reflect Dr. Paul Brown's suggestion of 0.74 acre-feet per acre. So these numbers are really close to what already exists in the management plan, but how we derive them comes from a more scientific basis based on scientific research and more realistic numbers. That's all I have for the non-golf turf related updates, and I'd be happy to take any questions. You can start the timer, I believe, McKenna.
Hello, this is Andrew with the Town of Gilbert. My colleague Jeff was the one that you mentioned who kind of worked on some of those numbers, and he had a question. I'm standing in for him today regarding the possibility for variance on particular sites. So the number that you have displayed for the Phoenix AMA is a blended number from some of the percentages that sounds like you reviewed last time in terms of athletic turf versus non-athletic turf. So in some of the newer constructions, it sounds like there is quite a few that have primarily athletic turf and little non-athletic turf or ornamental turf. So would there be instances where that variance could be applied?
Hey, Andrew. Yes, thank you for your and Jeff's work has been instrumental in this proposal. So I thank you for your work and for your feedback today. So while there won't be a specific administrative review process for non-golf turf facilities, they will be able to file for administrative review during the admin review process. So we've sort of eliminated that extra administrative review step, but they'd be able to apply for admin review during the typical administrative review process and time period.
Thank you. I noticed in the chat too, which maybe you're reviewing later on for reclaimed water. Our understanding was there's a 40% additional amount for reclaimed. Is that still going to be maintained for the 5th management plan, or are there any discussions for that, adjusting that number?
Yeah, thank you. So the extra effluent allotment of 40% was a value that was implemented during the 3rd management plan period. And while we don't have historical record on what that was based on, we are hoping to update it in the future, and we do appreciate stakeholder feedback on this. I chatted to Jeff a little bit with regards to this, and we are hoping to update it in the future. Thank you for that question, Andrew. Okay, I think I will move on to other questions I see in the chat box here. Does the yearly allotment apply to potable and reclaimed water? So it applies for any facilities using groundwater with the effluent adjustments. Chip Howard says, is the acreage still applied to facilities with 10 acres or more? Yes. It's facilities that are greater than 10 acres at this time. David Prout has commented, was consideration given to reducing managed turf sites from 10 acres to lower number? Case in point, COS has 46 turf facilities, yet only 7 are managed in the ADWR AMA. This represents only 15% of our sites. lowering the facility turf size instantly controls more sites with greater opportunity of water reductions. Yeah, thank you, David, for that comment. This is a comment that we've received time and time again, and we worked really hard to explore our ability to have this apply to facilities that are less than 10 acres. We realized that there could be a gap there, and at this time, we don't have the human power and the capabilities to implement this program to facilities less than 10 acres. So we acknowledge this as well, and for the time being and for the fifth management plan, it's just going to apply for facilities that are greater than 10 acres. Thank you for that feedback, though. Andrew, are there any formal definitions planned or available for ornamental versus athletic turf for sites that may be close to overage? Yeah, Andrew, thank you for that. We are in the process right now of writing the industrial chapter, which will include a section that we will have definitions of what is ornamental turf, what is athletic turf, and right now we don't have those definitions, but like I said, our team is actively writing the industrial portion of that. And when we have those definitions, we will bring that to the group. That will be part of the regulatory language. So we are planning on reviewing all of the regulatory language with the stakeholder and regulated community. Right now, no definitions, but there will be. All right, I'm not seeing any additional questions or comments in the chat. David, that's unfortunate. I see HOAs with large turf areas over water on a daily basis. Yeah, thanks, David. It is unfortunate. We, we could find out a way to have these programs apply to facilities that are under 10 acres. We acknowledge that would be beneficial, but right now, 10 acres or greater. Bree, can you remind us of how many HOAs are currently in the program? Bree, I don't have that number right now, but I would be happy to get it to you following this meeting.
I deleted that.
All right. If anybody has any additional questions on the non-golf turf related proposals, please feel free to email me, email the management plans team, so we'd be happy to help you answer any questions that you might have. And for that, I think that concludes my portion, and I will pass it back to you, Natalie or Amanda.
All right, thank you, Maggie, I appreciate it. If we could go to the next slide, please, McKenna. We'll go ahead and hand things off to Amanda for the next section.
Thank you, Natalie. Just to answer your question, Bree, in the Phoenix AMA, there are 112 HOAs regulated in the non-golf turf program.
Thank you, Amanda.
Okay, so this is Amanda Long. I am the Management Plans Program Coordinator, and I'm going to walk you through the program updates for the Golf Course Conservation Program today. So when talking about potential updates to the Golf Conservation Program, we have discussed several goals listed here on the slide. The first is for increased conservation. This is the statutory requirement that the department has to reduce withdrawals of groundwater and to increase conservation with each successive management plan. The middle section in blue are other non-statutory goals that we have discussed throughout this subgroup process as department goals for an updated conservation program. The current conservation program for golf is incredibly complex, difficult to understand with many rules and caveats for each course category. So we had goals to make this program more transparent, increase simplicity so that it is easier for both the regulated community and staff to understand. We also had the goal to use application rates that were realistic to current practices and that are more scientifically based. A simpler and more transparent program is also less prone to administrative errors and is easier to communicate to you all and easier in terms of enforcement. The final goal in this middle section is to be equitable and reasonable with how the program is impacting the current Forest Management Plan course categories. And the last goal here in gray is also related to equity, and it's something that was further developed after speaking with stakeholders, that the conservation program should be balanced. Not all courses are equal in their conservation potential. Some are already taking significant conservation measures, while others may have more conservation potential. So the conservation program for golf should have a smaller impact to those who have taken significant conservation measures already, but also not too severe to those courses that could have more conservation potential. Next slide, please, McKenna. So in order to meet these goals, we had initially outlined this proposal in the subgroup last year. As with previous plans, this proposal is a method that could be used to calculate the allotment. Courses are still, as always, able to apply that water within their facility as they see fit. What I have on the slide here is what's been on the Fifth Management Plan's concept page. It's a summary of that initial proposal for each AMA. I did go into some more detail for each of the AMAs at a previous subgroup meeting. So this initial proposed method divided the program into two course categories, one that is above and one that is below 5 acres per hole. 5 acres per hole is 90 acres for a 18-hole golf course. It also included 3 turf application rates, one for overseeded acres, one for non-overseeded acres, and one for acres that are over 5 acres per hole. These application rates were based off of the work of Dr. Paul Brown of the University of Arizona Extension, which he also presented to this subgroup last year. The 3 turf application rates helps with streamlining and the transparency of the program. In previous plans, the application rate for turf was for Bermuda grass and was low, but the low water use application rate was high, with the knowledge that some of that water may be shuffled around to be used on turfed acres to allow for some level of overseed. The 3 application rates in this initial proposed method sought to create an allotment that would increase water sufficient to overseed some turfed acres while correcting the water allotted to low water use acres and decreasing the total allotment at an AMA scale. The proposal also included an allotment for water surface acres, which, similar to the non-golf program, we are not recommending changing from the Forest Management Plan. Each course category also had limits for each application rate category. The limits were designed to be more generous to courses that are smaller or in the below 5 acres per hole category. These differences reflect the goal of balance and equity between the courses. One thing I did also want to point out is that highlighted blue square in the chart. This was previously incorrectly written as 5 acres per hole, and it has been updated to 5 acre feet per hole, which carries forward the limitation that was previously set for additional turfed acres in the 3rd and 4th management plans. So we did get significant amount of feedback on this initial proposed method, and based on that feedback, we would like to introduce an update to that proposal today. Next slide. So this slide shows 2 charts. The left in gray is the initial proposed method, and the one on the right in blue is the updated proposed method. Both are specific to the Phoenix AMA, but we did do this exercise for each one of the AMAs whose limits might differ slightly from the Phoenix AMA, and we did have similar results. So looking at the gray chart to the left side of that black line shows the initial proposal, and the right side of that black line shows what the impact would be to each of the current Forest Management Forest Management Plan course categories in the Phoenix AMA. So this is the percent difference from the Forest Management Plan allotments compared to the proposed Fifth Management Plan. C1 and C2 are courses that were established before 1985. C3 and C4 are courses that were established after 1984. And also C2 and C4 are the regulation golf courses. So as you can see here on the aggregate, highlighted in green there at the bottom, are the total reductions for the initial proposal, which is about 3.2% as compared to the Forest Management Plan for the Phoenix AMA. So after hearing your concern, we have developed an updated proposed method. We will include this update as part of a 3-part package for the golf conservation program. So the updated proposed allotment method is part 1 of this package. It's shown on the chart in the right in blue. It keeps a large portion of the initial proposal the same, but includes an application rate for low water use acres for all courses. This is the only change from the initial proposal, and it's highlighted there in purple on the slide. Including low water use acres addresses the concern that we heard from this group that low water use was incorrectly kept out of the initial proposal and that there was need for water for some of those acres. Including the low water use acres also helps to address our goal of balance and equity, softening the impact to smaller, efficient courses, but also not severely impacting those courses that may have more room for conservation. The low water use acres application rate is from Dr. Brown's research and is 0.74 acre-feet per acre, limited to 1 acre per hole. So similar to the initial proposed method, this update creates an allotment that increases the water sufficient to overseed some turfed acres while correcting the water allotted to low water use acres and decreasing the total allotment at the AMA scale. So the results of the proposed method for the Phoenix AMA is there at the bottom right of the blue chart, and it is about 2.2%. So it's a reduction from our initial proposal. We have also created a calculator that's posted on the Fifth Management Plan concept page to help with calculating your individual allotments. This calculator has been updated to reflect this new method. Next slide, please. So part 2 of the proposal package is related to the effluent adjustment. We have previously discussed the effluent adjustment as something that might be changed to reflect the current value of effluent versus its value in previous management plan periods. Where in previous plans, the incentive was designed to reflect that effluent often posed a disposal issue, effluent is now seen as a valuable part of a water supply portfolio. However, given the concerns we have heard from the industry about the value of this incentive, as a part of this package, we will propose that the effluent incentive remain at the same level as the Fourth Management Plan. This package that we are talking about is specific to golf, but the effluent incentive also applies to the non-golf program. So we will also propose no changes to the effluent adjustment for the non-golf program. Next slide, please. The third and final part of the proposal package is related to allotment additions. We had originally recommended a couple of changes to the allotment additions, but after hearing your feedback and concern, we have adjusted a couple of these recommendations. So I'll start with the bottom 2 on the slide, the addition for filling and refilling water bodies, and the allotment addition for the consideration of leaching. We discussed both of these at a previous subgroup meeting, and will continue to not recommend any changes to these additions and keep them the same as the Fourth Management Plan. The top 2 allotment additions we had previously recommended removing. The revegetation allotment is for low water use acres. We are now proposing to keep this allotment addition, but to update this to a rate that is more science-based and is the same number that's being used in the non-golf program and in the allotment calculation for golf courses. So that's 0.74 acre-feet per acre. The newly turfed allotment addition is related to new acres of turf. We had originally recommended removing this as there was some concern for this addition to allow for increased acres of total turfed area. However, we received quite a bit of feedback about courses that are using this addition in the future for renovation purposes as opposed to increasing turfed area. So our updated recommendation is to keep this addition, but only allow an additional allotment if the total turfed acres does not exceed the current amount of turf. So this would allow the addition to be used for renovation, but not necessarily for increasing turf. And again, this package, part 3 we're talking about is for golf, but the allotment additions do also apply to the non-golf program. So we are going to recommend the same changes to the allotment addition for the non-golf program, the same as the golf program. So that does conclude my presentation on the proposed package for the conservation program for golf. But before we pause for questions, we do have a guest presentation, and I will pass it off to ADWR Director Tom Bishotsky to provide an introduction.
Thanks, Amanda. So before I start with the introduction, I just want to say this is the first meeting of this group that I've attended. I think part of the reason is that we're getting closer to the finish line. I want to thank everybody who's participated in this group to date. I know we presented a lot of information. We've asked you all to do a lot of homework, and your feedback is critical to us putting together a plan that works for everybody, that meets that statutory requirement that Natalie talked about earlier, and that has a good policy behind it. I think you all know that we're under the gun to get the 5th management plans done on time, as Natalie discussed. It's a result of DWR falling behind schedule on promulgating the 4th and 5th management plans, so we're in a bit of a catch-up mode, and I appreciate your understanding in that regard, and again, working with us to get these plans done on time so that they can be effective in 2025, as Natalie mentioned. So we are going to have a presentation by golf stakeholders, and I'll just start by saying, much like we have relayed to everybody on the agricultural work group, a group of agricultural stakeholders have been meeting with the department since early in the fall of last year. I've been attending those meetings as well, and they are very helpful. That group has really created a lot of solid interaction with the department. They've been very accommodating in coming to consensus agreement on the 4th management plan, are working hard with us on the 5th management plan. Likewise, this group of golf stakeholders has been meeting with my staff, and lately I've attended some of those meetings as well. And so I think, again, this group has been very helpful in relaying concerns, relaying potential elements of the program, and really creating a very solid interaction between the group and DWR. So I think today we asked them to make a presentation, and I think perhaps they might give us some insight on their views of this updated proposal. And I think my understanding is, Katie, you're going to start off for your group. And if you're ready to go, we'll be happy to hear from you and the rest of the members of your group.
Thank you, Director. I appreciate that and the background with respect to the process. You and your staff have been accessible and responsive, and we really appreciate you and your team's willingness to engage with us as we seek to have these ongoing conversations. And I'd like to especially recognize and sincerely thank Amanda, Natalie, Carol, and Clint for their continued willingness to regularly meet with us and have dialogue on these topics that really are of the utmost importance to our industry. So thank you. As the director mentioned, my name is Katie Prendergast, and I'm with Horizon Strategies, representing the Arizona Alliance for Golf. For this update, I'm also joined by fellow Alliance members, Rob Collins of the Paradise Valley Country Club and Bree Kenny of Troon, both of whom have lent their expertise to this process so far. And by way of very brief background, the Arizona Alliance for Golf was formed during the 4th Management Plan conversations to bring greater unity and cohesion to the industry voice, both at that time and then knowing that we would quickly be moving into the development of the 5th Management Plan. And I think we've been really fortunate at the Alliance to be able to rely on and call upon a very vast network of industry experts who have been working at this and participating in these discussions for years and in some cases decades. So I'd like to specifically mention the Cactus and Pine Golf Course Superintendents Association's Water Committee has really been an invaluable resource, led by Mark Woodward as the board president of Cactus and Pine. We've been working closely with him and his team, including Rory Van Pocky, who many of you know. Rory's been a longtime leader in the golf course water space, and we've been grateful for Rory's guidance as we've sought to navigate these conversations, and the historical perspective has been invaluable. So the deep subject matter expertise from Cactus and Pine, the Arizona Golf Association, Troon, and others has really served as a foundation for the Alliance's conversations with ADWR over the past many months, going back into last fall. And as has been talked about previously, and as we all know, these management plans are complex. And we know that the broader water and water use conversation can be extraordinarily complex as well. It really can be a language of its own. And because of that, we share in the department's goal to create future plans that are simpler and easier for both the regulators to explain and for the regulated to understand. And so while we still have some issues that we're working through, from where we sit today, we wanted to provide an update. And I think there are several issues that are especially important in that approach to developing a more simplistic framework. And the first and possibly most important is the need to base the 5th Management Plan on what the science tells us is realistically achievable for industry today. We know that the 3rd Management Plan established a rate that did not accurately reflect golf course needs. And at the same time, the department created a variety of levers in the form of incentives, adjustments, other additions that provided sufficient workaround for industry to be able to operate their courses. And during the 4th Management Plan conversations, the segments of the industry that we've spoken to were all under the impression that there was a commitment to address that incorrect base rate for purposes of the 5th Management Plan. And so when we review the conceptual proposals that have been presented, the industry remains concerned because the underlying base rate for turf is still based on what we believe to be flawed numbers. Not only that, but if the levers and workarounds that were previously built into other plans are going to be reduced or otherwise modified, it's even more essential that the underlying base rate is fixed. And as an industry, we believe that the science is clear in terms of what's achievable for industry, and basing allotments off of the scientifically supported data is critical in the context of this conversation. Of particular priority is the 75% efficiency factor, not 80%, as the base of what industry can achieve, which has consistently been the message from the scientists like Dr. Brown from the University of Arizona, who's worked closely with ADWR and industry in the past. I think we know we have an ongoing challenge in these conversations of what the science tells us the base rate should be. And so we welcome additional conversations with the department on that point as we seek to get back to a place of science-based decisions. And our second focus has really been around concepts that would help create a plan that is tailored to appropriately capture the efficiencies and sophisticated conservation measures that many in the industry have implemented, with categories and metrics that are appropriately targeted. We know that there are vastly different golf course footprints, and how to best capture those efficiencies within the context of those disparate footprints is, again, another aspect that we welcome additional conversation around. And I know that, on today's call, there are many expert participants who likely have ideas and thoughts that they can lend to this particular aspect of the conversation. And from an Alliance perspective, we would welcome more input on what those metrics should be to appropriately capture the efficiencies. And as an Alliance, we're happy to take any and all input on the themes that I've sort of touched on today. We've been fortunate to engage with a multitude of experts, but if there are other folks that would like to reach out, please don't hesitate to do so. I'm happy to put my contact information in the chat if that's helpful. As I mentioned at the start, and as you see on the screen, both Rob Collins and Bree Kenny are part of the Alliance, and I thank them for the wealth of data and other expertise that they've provided. I'd like to quickly turn it over to Rob from Paradise Valley Country Club for some brief comments, if that's still possible.
Thanks, Katie. This is Rob Collins, Paradise Valley Country Club. Katie brings up a few good points, and especially the point regarding the science. I think all of us as turf managers recognize that our real world use rates are much different than the rates that are being discussed in the management plans. And so I think all of us would really relish the chance to use the science to represent ongoing regulation. Some specific points about things that we've talked about regarding the changing management plans. The comment about fair and equitable, again, as someone who's out there using water on a routine basis and managing turf now for 30 years in Arizona, the fair and equitable discussion seems to center on a per acre basis. And I understand that's a very easy way to look at this problem. And intuitively, it sounds like if we do things on a per acre basis, everybody's treated the same. But the truth is, small acreage courses don't have as much leeway as large acreage courses. And so there's a challenge within our industry about how we deal with changing regulation when it comes to the topic of fair and equitable and how it's distributed across so many different golf courses. In kind of the same way, when we start talking about overseeding as a topic or as a component of the regulation, it too, Katie used the phrase lever, it too becomes a lever. And again, that isn't necessarily equitable across all of these acreages. One thing I would encourage the department to do is to look at the small acreage courses in terms of their potential water use as a 90-acre course. The way the regulation is written, all courses in Arizona have the potential to have as many as 90 acres of turf, and so I think that's a responsible way to look at it within our industry. Another point that I would like to make is with regard to golf courses over 90 acres. Since the third management plan, we've had kind of that distinction made within the regulation that there's pre-85 courses that are potentially greater than 90 acres, post-84 courses that are 90 or less, but 90 acres has been identified as kind of a benchmark for a golf course. And so with future regulation, if that continues to be a distinction, I think it's very easy to show reduction in groundwater withdrawal when we exceed 90 acres. That's an easy and very observable benchmark to recognize a real reduction. So that's essentially what I wanted to mention today. I'll echo Katie's comments that we really do appreciate the state's willingness to work with the turf industry. We've had a number of turf breakout meetings. I think that's outstanding, and we really appreciate that opportunity. So thank you.
Thanks, Rob. And if I could just quickly and it was my error for not mentioning it at the start in terms of the context that we're sort of working in. You know, I think we as an industry understand that the department has a statutory obligation to increase conservation of the industry in the aggregate. And so as an industry, how we're partnering with the department to create a dynamic you know, that works on both sides is something that we are very interested in, we're very committed to. And so I just wanted to add that quick point, but appreciate the time on the agenda today and would welcome any thoughts or questions.
So this is Director Brzezinski. Thanks, Katie and Rob. I'll just say in terms of the 90-acre issue, my golf ball expands the golf course beyond 5 acres per hole just on its own. It's not necessarily on turf, but it always wants to expand the size. So I don't know whether that means anything, but regardless, the points are well taken. We at DWR also want to make our program more scientifically based. The levers that were created under the third management plan were necessary then under the makeup of that plan, and I think some of that was about overseeding or not and how that played into the allotment number, the per acre foot number that the department used. We like to see as many levers go away as possible and base more of this on science. We're with you there, but we also need to recognize, as Katie correctly alluded to at the end, that we do have to reduce the groundwater withdrawals by increasing conservation, and our view is if we can get there with the industry as a whole, that is a success story for us. And you saw in the updated proposal, the total number was, I think, negative 2.2%. So we're achieving that goal. At the same time, we don't want a course to be cut by 40 or 50% if you apply some purely scientific standards, and in combination with needing to have an overall reduction in the golf course industry water use. And we think this is important for a lot of reasons. It's not just, in my mind, the statutory requirement to reduce the use, but there are always eyes on the state of Arizona in terms of water use, external parties. There's always eyes on the golf course industry. And as we're heading into 2022, a likely reduction to the state of Arizona of 512,000 acre feet of Colorado River water, we're going to want to really tout what the golf course industry, the turf industry is doing to be good stewards. And I think this program, as we're designing it, helps us also achieve that policy goal. Because again, there's going to be a lot of light on the golf course industry when that shortage reduction hits. In 2003, when the Salt River Project announced reductions in its per acre foot allocations, there was a lot of light on the golf course industry then, and that was within a very limited service area in relation to the Phoenix AMA and in relation to all 5 AMAs. And so I've kind of lived that already in my role back then working for the city of Phoenix. So it's been great working with stakeholders, this ad hoc group. We continue to want to work closely with you to come to what I think can be a good compromise. And certainly we want the larger stakeholder group that we're talking with here today to also weigh in on that updated proposal and hopefully recognize that a compromise is what's needed, and hopefully the package as a whole, as we described, part 1, 2, and 3 of the package, can largely work for as many golf courses as possible. I don't want an outcome in which there's an avalanche of administrative reviews. That is a time crunch and financial crunch for the golf course industry, but it's a time crunch and a financial crunch for my department as well. I don't know that we can get to an outcome in which everyone will be happy and there will be not one administrative review filed for, but we are keeping that in mind as well as we kind of work through this program. So with that, I guess we'll turn it over for the group Q&A. And thank you, everybody.
Hi, this is Rory Van Pocky.
Go ahead, Rory.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to first, I appreciate Arizona Department of Water Resources, Natalie, Tom, Clint, Carol, everyone involved here. I've been at many, many meetings, as you know, and I've seen the difficult positions and challenges that you face. We are in a water crunch, what Tom just alluded to, but I really appreciate and extend my appreciation of your courtesy to have dialogue with us. And that's why from the with the fourth plan, we did a compromise that would hopefully help everyone concerned, because we realize water is a very valuable resource. And if some suggestions, if we could down the road, we have the best management practices that we implemented, how we could reduce our footprint and manage water as good as we can. And then just some different things, maybe if you ever want to do a tour, like where Apache Sun Golf Club, we actually closed the water off, turned the water off in the summer for about 5.5 months and just water the trees on a drip system. And there's some other courses out there that are doing unique things. And I know you've done some tours, but I'd like to really appreciate your time and efforts. And I know, Tom, is the more you get playing now, get that ball straighter down the middle. Thank you.
Thanks, Rory.
All right, we do have a question in the chat box from Bree with regards to the updated proposal package. She's commented, is that assuming everyone uses max low water use?
Back to that chart.
Hi, Bree. So the calculation that was shown several slides back was assuming that everyone uses up to 1 acre per hole of low water use acreage or allocation. So if an 18-hole course only has 15 acres of low water use plants, then they would only get the allocation for 15 acres. But if they have more than 18 acres, then they would only get the 18 acres worth of allocation there, if that makes sense.
Okay, so yeah, you're kind of assuming that everyone would say up to 18 acres of low water use.
Right. For an 18-hole course, it's up to 18 acres. So 1 acre per hole is the limitation there.
Okay, and with that, if only about 26% of groundwater users are using that allocation right now, does that mean they would be able to add in 18 under this proposal? Like the other 74%?
I'm not sure about that precise number, but in theory, a golf course could add, if they have 0 low water use acres now, they could add up to that 1 acre per hole of low water use acres, yes.
All right, and then can you just remind me of where that feedback came for adding that back in?
It was at several of the meetings that we had last summer. It came through sometimes through the chat, sometimes verbally, and then also through the questionnaires that we have at the end of each subgroup meeting. And a lot of it was in the questionnaire, actually.
And one additional thing there is that the 1 acre per hole limitation there was actually a recommendation that we had received initially from Dr. Brown.
Right, yeah. Can we go back and just display that chart so we can see it?
One
Okay,
more,
yeah,
that one. Thanks, McKenna. Oh, that one. Perfect. Thank you, McKenna.
Okay, that's helpful. And wait, sorry, one more question. Do you guys have it listed anywhere what the 75% and 80% efficiencies are under that proposal?
The previous slide lists the 80% efficiency rate.
Okay, thanks.
Maggie, would you, oh, go ahead, sorry.
If we're moving on, I'll read a question here that we have from Ryan. He's commented, if we are trying to conserve water with a turf reduction program on our golf course, are there grants out there to help pay for turf reduction?
It's a really good question, Ryan. Thank you for asking that question. ADWR does not currently have those types of grants, but we certainly acknowledge that turf reduction can be a costly thing. We've heard this type of suggestion several times now, but it's not something we currently have available. And I guess I'm not sure if there are other types of grants available out there that might have that type of funding available.
Thank you, Natalie. Question here from Alex Arboleda. She's commented, did the department consider any alternative conservation programs for industrial users, such as a BMP program?
So this is Director Brashatsky, and Alex, I'm going to answer that question. So certainly internally, we've had some discussions about the concept of a BMP program. You know as well as anybody, because you're part of the Ag stakeholder group, that in the Ag BMP program, there was statutory changes made. There was an advisory committee that was just recently reinvigorated to certify those BMPs, work on the points, work on the tiers. Very complicated. It's not something that I think we can work through and come up with a solid, scientifically based alternative for the fifth management plan for the turf industry. It's something maybe out into the future to consider if and when the legislature requires the department to do additional management plans, because I think most of you know that the fifth management plan is the last plan required by the current statutory structure. So again, there might be some way out into the future to create an alternative program that has BMPs as part of it, but that's certainly not something that we're going to be working on for the fifth management plan.
Thank you, Director. Rob Collins has commented, you mentioned an updated turf calculator. Is the link available? And McKenna Welsh has dropped the link to that turf calculator in the chat box for the group's reference. Bree Kenny has also commented that 80% is 5.84 and 75% is 6.23. There are no further comments or questions in the chat box at this time. Sorry, I spoke too soon. Bree Kenny has another question. Bree, you're welcome to unmute yourself.
Hey, sorry. I just want to make sure that it's clear. Can we go back to that slide that's showing the chart of the updated proposal? Okay, yeah, so in the Phoenix where it's saying 5.84, so what the Alliance was saying earlier is Dr. Brown's rates were showing for 80%, it was 6.23, and in those slides on that presentation, he wrote down that 6.23 was challenging but realistic, and the 5.84 was, how did he phrase it? Idealistic and unlikely attainable. So I just wanted to make that point, like we've used Dr. Brown's numbers here for the low water use, for the water surface acreage, but we're still having this debate over the turf rate. And I was looking at 15 properties that I know their water usage and I know their turf and water surface allocations pretty well. And they were coming out at 6.4 for actual water use. So I think that kind of shows that Dr. Brown's point that 6.23 is challenging but realistic is kind of fitting in with that across Scottsdale courses. And maybe, I guess the question there would be like, can you guys just maybe reiterate for the group where that our differences in that rate is coming from?
Hi, Bree. Thanks for that question. So in order to meet our statutory requirement for reductions and withdrawals of groundwater, we have moved forward with the 80% rate. This is a rate that is a goal to reach. It's something that Dr. Brown proposed. He proposed both rates to us, and in order to meet our statutory reduction in withdrawals of groundwater, we decided to move forward with the 80%. There's two kind of application rates that use the 80%, the overseeded and the non-overseeded, with two different limits. So in order to use that 75% number and still maintain withdrawals, reductions in withdrawals of groundwater, we would have to adjust the limitations for the amount of turf we're considering encapsulated in the allotment.
The amount of turf in each category. So essentially what we would have to do is reduce the amount of overseeded acres assumed in order to maintain that reductions in withdrawals of groundwater. So what we're kind of trying to do here is find that balance between applying the scientific numbers to this policy while still meeting our statutory obligation of reducing withdrawals of groundwater.
Natalie, we have a question here from Jeff Spangler. He's commented, how was overseeding up to 65 acres determined?
Thank you for that question, Jeff. The 65 acres we tried several different ways to balance between the two course categories, and the 65 acres number was kind of the balance that we met that would decrease withdrawals of groundwater, but still keep the program somewhat equitable to all the current forest management plan course categories.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm not seeing any other questions or comments at this time. Oops, sorry. Mark Daly has commented, regarding the low water use for non-golf, how was 0.74 acre feet per acre determined? Thank you, Mark. This was a recommendation based on data from the University of Arizona and Dr. Paul Brown, who presented at our group in the summer.
So this is Director Bishotsky, and I actually have a question for Dr. Brown. I see his name, not to put him on the spot, but that 0.74 feet per acre for low water use, is there some density factor in terms of how dense the vegetation is on a low water use acre? So if you have one low water use acre that has a couple of saguaro cactus on it versus a low water use acre that has ground cover, how does that play into the 0.74 feet per acre? If that's a meaningful question, which hopefully it is.
First, can people hear me?
Yes, Dr. Brown, go ahead.
Okay. I apologize for being late. I had a previous conference call that went an hour. So what I did, and I made it very clear when we discussed this low water use landscape business, that the landscape water use is not nearly as scientifically based as I would say the turf information is. But what we used was a kind of a uniform. Let me just check my notes before I get myself in trouble here. Yeah, what we used was low water use species from a publication generated out of California called WUCOLS, which is water use something for low landscape plants. And we used an average density, which is, by their definition, 1. It's not thin, but it's not excessive and layered. So, but we used a low water use landscape species because that was what was in the law or in the rules to date. And so those species use a very low fraction of atmospheric evaporative demand. And as a result of that, we came out with a number that was very close. We came out with a number that suggested 13 inches a year comes off of these low water use landscapes, but then we backed off that because of rainfall amounts, and that's how we got to, I think it's 8.9 inches or 0.74 feet. So it's not a very thinly landscaped area. It's what I'd consider maybe what you'd consider a low water use portion of a xeriscape. I hope that helps.
Yes, Dr. Brown, that helps me tremendously. Thank you.
Were there any more questions or comments from anyone on the?
We had a question.
Oh.
Thank you, Natalie. A couple of questions trickling in now. Bree Kenny has commented, since we have Dr. Brown on, could we have him clarify on why 75% is likely attainable?
I guess my microphone's still on, is that correct?
Yes, Dr. Brown, go ahead.
Okay. When we came up with, let me open up my notes so that I don't get caught acting ignorant. One of the challenges we have in the golf industry, I'm going to be honest with you, and actually in all of agriculture, is honest measurements of efficiency. And so you have to be a bit careful on how you define it, but what I was trying to define was what fraction of the total water that's applied is actually going to go out in the form of evaporation from the landscape. So that's the first thing. And so what we did in analyzing that is we went into the literature and looked at what are the losses purported to occur in sprinkler systems from leaks, from evaporation and drift. Those two are very hard to separate, and for those who don't understand the difference, there's water that from the head to the ground evaporates, becomes vapor, and then there is liquid water that along the edges of fairways and other areas that drifts off site and out of and is no longer useful to the area that you're trying to irrigate. And what we came up with was that losses would be around 1% from leaks in a well-maintained system. The evaporation and drift numbers, according to the literature, are run probably between 5 and 10% of the water is lost to evaporation and drifts. And so we came up with some estimates of what we thought those would be. And then we added that into the issue of non-uniformity of irrigation, and no sprinkler system is 100% uniform. And so there's a non-uniformity issue, much of which is analyzed using catch cans and assessed using some standard computational procedures called distribution uniformity calculations. We went into the literature there and we looked at what people recommend as optional distribution uniformities, or optimal and acceptable distribution uniformities, and came up with some estimates of how much additional water a golf course would have to apply to the dry areas of the course caused by non-uniform irrigation. And we came up with those computations. And in the end, we felt that a distribution uniformity, that's the uniformity of sprinklers, of 0.7 was challenging but attainable on a golf course. And we felt like idealistically and unlikely unattainable or sustainable would be a DU of 0.8. That's 80% uniformity. And when we added in the transit losses, the leaks, and the drift to the extra water factors that the Irrigation Association recommends for those non-uniformities, we came up with efficiencies of 0.75 for challenging and realistic, and 0.82 for idealistic and unlikely attainable. In my subsequent analysis that I submitted to the state and I gave to this group in previous meetings, I just used 0.75 and 0.8 as efficiencies in the computations that came up with estimates of consumptive use, or estimates of irrigation need. So that's how we came up with those. One of the frustrations as a scientist on this is that there are very few realistic measurements of irrigation efficiency out there in the turf sector. There's a lot of discussion of uniformity of irrigation, but not about overall efficiency. And what we tried to do with this analysis was put a realistic basis for how to come up with those numbers, or what kind of numbers those should be. Personally, as somebody, I'm retired now, but as a scientist, I would be thrilled to see someone take this on scientifically and give us some honest scientific numbers instead of having to kind of bowl it together like I did, but I haven't found those data to date.
So Dr. Brown, you're offering to come out of retirement for us?
Well,
I'm just kidding. For those of you who don't know this, Dr. Brown worked with folks out in Yuma on their ag efficiency study, and I work very closely with him and the folks in Yuma, so I'm giving him a bit of a hard time, but I recognize in that process Dr. Brown's expertise, and you just heard how thorough he is, and I have great confidence in the information that Dr. Brown has been sharing with the department.
I thank you, Tom, and for the right intellectual challenge, I will come out of retirement to do some work, but I'm not sure I want to get on anybody's payroll anymore.
Okay, moving forward, thank you for that. We have a question here from Gary Brawley. Why the limit of 1 acre per hole on low water use allotment? There are golf courses that have taken out significantly more than 1 acre per hole and are using ADWR, low water use landscape plantings. Should it not be site specific?
Hi, Gary. Thanks for your question. So part of the rationale for that limitation is a little bit twofold. Part of it is kind of a practical thing on our side because it kind of limits the number of acres that ADWR would theoretically in the future need to audit or verify. So it makes things it helps streamline things administratively in that sense. The other piece of that goes right back to what we've kept referencing here is that reductions in withdrawals of groundwater. We can't allow that particular application rate to be unlimited. You can see the impact in the difference in the percentages between the chart on the left and the chart on the right that just 1 acre per hole has. So allowing a higher acreage for those low water use application rate simply further cuts into those small reductions that we were able to achieve under this proposal. Something I will say is that often we have heard that depending on the type of low water use landscape planting, many of those low water use acres may not need to be irrigated as much or at all once they are established. So there's some consideration of that here, and there's some consideration of allowing some irrigation of low water use acreage, particularly in the areas around clubhouses and that type of thing that are typically a little bit more lush.
Thank you, Natalie. Chip Howard has a comment. Chip, you're welcome to unmute yourself.
Thank you. My opinion represents nothing more than my opinion, but with the system you've put together of diminished return, recognizing that the smaller golf courses that have already made a lot of sacrifice are not particularly impacted, and some of the excessive acreage properties where there is opportunity for savings, I think you've addressed that, and especially now that you're planning to leave the effluent credit in its current position. You certainly have my good feelings on what you're doing. In my opinion, job well done.
Thank you for that, Chip.
All right, anything else before we move on?
Katie Prendergast has included her email in the chat box and is thanking the group for their time on the agenda. No further questions or comments other than that.
McKenna, if you would skip to slide 30, please. We're gonna skip ahead just a little bit here because we're running out of time. So it is 11:28 already. We do really appreciate all of the robust discussion and all of the questions throughout today's meeting. McKenna, if you could go to the next slide, please. As we mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, kind of with the feedback that we've received today and with additional feedback that we may be receiving through the questionnaire that we'll be posting in the chat here again, we will consider what additional discussions we need to have and potentially schedule a next meeting for this group. We will announce that next date by email. And as we're developing the regulatory language for these proposed programs, we would also come back to this group and review that draft regulatory language with everyone. If we could go to the next slide, please. We do have some other Fifth Management Plan subgroups coming up. I would encourage everyone to check ADWR's public meetings calendar. We also have a 5MP webpage that we've mentioned a couple times here. The 5MP webpage has links to all of our previous meetings, recordings of all of those meetings, And the concepts page on that 5MP web page, as I mentioned earlier, has summaries of each of these concepts and things like that turf or the proposal calculator that Amanda mentioned earlier. Lots of good resources there to help you better understand the proposals that we're working through in these meetings. So with that, if we could go one more slide, please, McKenna. Great. With that, that's actually all we have today. We do, as I said, really appreciate all of the time and thought that all of you put into this. We know it's significant having all of these meetings, and we really appreciate the time you all take to provide us the feedback and engage with us on these issues. So with that, we'll go ahead and close out our meeting today. Thank you all for being here today, and we hope to talk with you all soon. Have a good day.